Excellent. Hi, everyone. The height issue is a problem, but we move. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Welcome to our commemoration of the 60th anniversary of Martin Luther King preaching here in Bloomsbury. This has been a day-long event. So earlier this afternoon, we had speakers including Professor Anthony Reddy, Richard Reddy, they are related, Dr. Hannah Elias, and we were all speaking and thinking through the legacy of Martin Luther King and his work. We had about 80 people online and in the building, and this is the latter of the two sections that make up this day and this commemoration celebration. I'm Udoka, I'm one of the deacons here at Bloomsbury, and we are so excited to welcome everybody and think together, but also to have a very celebratory tone. So this evening we'll be introduced to the sermon itself, and a little extract of the 3 dimensions of the complete life, preached by Martin Luther King. This isn't a recording of him preaching in Bloomsbury itself, but it's a recording of the same sermon just 3 months later. So it is still Martin Luther King, it's still him, it's just a bit later. We'll also be seeing some dance from Impact Dance, who are so cool. I'm so excited for you guys to be able to share in their youthful talent, as well as hearing from Emmanuel Gotora, who's the lead organizer of TELCO and North London Citizens, as well as Ife Thompson, who will be online. And she's incredible. She's a community-based activist, writer, human rights defender, barrister, and also founded 2 civil society organizations in BLAM UK and Black Protest Legal Support UK. A lot of acronyms this evening, quite good, but like important work. Just to contextualize, this evening is really about understanding the more active, more protest, more direct action-oriented side of Martin Luther King Jr.'s ministry. Earlier today, we were kind of wrestling with theological questions and the questions about the politics underpinning his work. And this is the outworking of that. What do these views, do these actions, do these ideas look like when presented in British society today? We're obviously living in the aftermath of 2020 with the violence and the protests that happened then, and very much shaped by that and these occurrences. But we are living in the long aftermath of enslavement and even longer aftermath of colonialism and imperialism, and we'll be mediating upon some of those themes and these questions this evening. Participation is welcome, and there will also be forums and ample space and time to ask any questions, because part of the process of learning and engaging, as Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, is asking questions and being challenged and expressing challenges. So I want to invite everyone into that space of learning and understanding today. But before we do all that, Reverend Simon Woodman will be contextualizing the sermon a little bit, giving you some of the history. Not all of you would have been here earlier today. So there's some of the contexts that Martin Luther King Jr. would have been speaking into 60 years ago in Bloomsbury, before we hear an excerpt from his preaching. But anyway, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited for us to all experience this together. Simon.
Udoka, thank you for that great introduction. I'm just going to alter the angle slightly of that, and then we can blank that again. Although, Liz, are you going to put the PowerPoint up? Fantastic. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes now explaining something about the significance of Martin Luther King for the church here at Bloomsbury, and outlining some of the context of the weekend that he came here. Those of you who've been part of the church here for a while, and I know there are some of our members here this evening, and welcome to you as well as to everybody else, will know that a significant feature of the defining mythology of Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church is that Martin Luther King Jr. preached there once. So you don't have to have been attending very long at this church before someone will say to you, did you know Martin Luther King preached there? It's mentioned proudly in the church history, and all these decades later is still remembered and recounted by people who were there at the time. I mentioned Clive this afternoon. Clive was so looking forward to being here this evening. He heard Martin Luther King preach here, and sadly he died a couple of weeks ago. So we miss him because the connections to that event are fading from our real memories. So it becomes important to keep telling the story. And as I said, newcomers to the church are swiftly inducted into this story. And it's often used as an example of the kind of church that Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church aspires to be. What is less well known is that the sermon that King delivered at Bloomsbury was a sermon called The Three Dimensions of the Complete Life, in which, as we shall hear, he used the image of the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation in the Bible to call people to a life of equal length, breadth, and height. And this is because in the book of Revelation, where it describes the heavenly city, it basically describes it as a cube, equal on all three sides. And by Dr. King's exegesis, a long life is one where a person's talents are harnessed and developed to the full. And a broad life is a life that has an outgoing concern for the welfare of others. And then a life of height intentionally includes a person's relationship with the divine as the pinnacle of a complete life, recognizing that personal and humanitarian concerns are too small without this third dimension. So Liz, if we can move on to the picture of Martin and Loretta King, please. This sermon was one which Dr. King reused over many years. Next slide as well, please. Having been the first sermon his wife ever heard him give. And she commented in her biography that it has a special meaning for me because it was the first sermon I ever heard him preach on a Sunday long ago in a little church at Roxbury, Massachusetts. Those of us who are preachers sometimes get accused of reusing our sermons. I take great comfort from the fact that Dr. King did it too. Next slide, please. Other notable places. He later delivered this same sermon on the 24th of January 1954 as his Preach with a View sermon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, a church he was to serve as the pastor of until 1960. And it was from this church that he organized the famous Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 56. And it was there that Rosa Parks, of course, enters into the story of liberation in America. He then returns to this sermon, The Three Dimensions, for his inaugural sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia in 1960, where he was to minister alongside his father until he was assassinated in 1968. And he also delivered it as his evensong sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1964. And comparisons of various instances of him delivering this sermon would suggest that he reworked it from a script, with the more exegetical sections of the sermon repeated almost verbatim each time, followed by a kind of off-the-cuff application section that was more varied. Regrettably, there is no direct record of him preaching at Bloomsbury, but those who were there remember the sermon well. And in addition to the conversations that I've had with people who were there, we also have a note written at the time by a woman called Eleanor Bowers, who is sadly no longer with us. And she said, and this is her testimony from the evening, "The vision given to John on Patmos of the New Jerusalem, a city whose dimensions were equal in length, breadth, and height, leapt into contemporary terms as he spoke on the three dimensions of the complete life. The length, harnessing and developing your given talents to the full. the breadth of outgoing concern for the welfare of others, and the height, the need to include God as the height of this vision for a complete life, to recognize God in every situation, and to realize that personal and humanitarian plans without this third dimension are too small. Well, the recording from which our excerpt this evening is taken was made on the 14th of January 1962 at Yale University, less than 3 months after King's visit to Bloomsbury. So it is close. So we think it is as close as we can get to hearing his voice on the evening. The Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, who is the senior pastor of King's former church at Ebenezer, Atlanta, now of course a senator, I think, in America, he says of this sermon, "Herein is the clarion call of a spiritual genius and sober-minded sentinel who insists that we pray with our lips and our feet and work with our heads, hearts, and hands for the beloved community, faithfully pushing aside the tide of what he often calls the triple evils of racism, materialism, and militarism in a divided world amid religious and political pronouncements on our public discourse that erroneously divide the self. We still need that message." So clearly for Martin Luther King, this sermon offered an enduring message which bore repetition throughout his ministry, communicating the essence of his vision for the African American civil rights movement. And so it is perhaps unsurprising that he should have used it for what was his first preaching engagement in London, here in this building. The invitation to preach at Bloomsbury had been issued by Howard Williams, the then minister of this church, only 3 weeks earlier, and King travelled to London for the weekend to fulfil a variety of engagements. His timeline for that weekend was fast-paced. He had just delivered a keynote address at Columbia University on the 27th of October. He'd departed for London, arriving in Heathrow on the morning of Saturday, the 28th of October. And this is a famous portrait of Martin Luther King arriving at Heathrow just the day before. Then we get to this portrait, which was drawn by Felix Topolsky. King went straight from the airport to the London studio of this artist, who drew his portrait, which was then used as the title sequence for a special live transmission of the BBC face-to-face interview programme on Sunday afternoon. And on the Sunday morning that King preached at Bloomsbury, he went afterwards back to the manse for lunch with the minister and his family. There are memories of him with the kids, bouncing them on his knee. I've spoken to one of the sons of the minister who can just remember as a small child meeting Martin Luther King. This is not the occasion he preached, but it is a photograph of this building really full in the olden days. So I thought I would just share that with you. And then Howard Williams, next slide please, the minister of Bloomsbury who had invited him, wrote a record of it, which went in the Baptist Times. Howard Williams said, "He came as a quiet man with a reputation. One might have expected that he would be big, loud and assertive, but he was gentle, quiet in conversation and persuasive in his public speaking. He had been to Britain before, but this was the first time for him to make public appearances, and I'm glad to think that his first sermon in this country was given at Bloomsbury. It was all authentic biography. This one thing I know." He was clearly delighted to recall that his mother and father had worshipped at Bloomsbury when the Baptist World Alliance had met in London in 1955. So he preached here, he went for lunch, and then in the evening, he was interviewed by John Freeman, the editor of the New Statesman, for the broadcast for the BBC, and another broadcast for ITV. And then the next day, on the Monday, he spoke at Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, on an anti-apartheid rally, looking at the situation of segregation in South Africa. And he was heckled with appalling cries of "Blacks go home." And then afterwards, he attended a reception sponsored by the Afro-Asia West Indian community at Africa Unity House, and then left London for New York the next day. And it was in the midst of this frenetic weekend of engagements, at just 3 weeks' notice, that he made time to speak on the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation in this church. We're now going to hear a 15-minute excerpt of him preaching, and the words will be on the screen, which will help you follow it if you're struggling with it. It's not the best recording in the world. And I know some of the dancers are going to sneak out now and go and do a warm-up, because when that's finished, we're going to have a performance from Impact Dance. But let's hear now from Dr. King.
From the subject, the dimensions of a complete life. Many, many centuries ago, a man by the name of John was in prison on a lonely, obscure island called Patmos. And in this situation, he had a vision of the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God. And one of the greatest glories of the new city of God that John saw was its completeness. It was not partial and one-sided, but it was complete in all three of its dimensions. So in describing the city in the 21st chapter of the book of Revelation, John says this: the length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. In other words, this new city of God, this city of ideal humanity, is not an unbalanced entity, but it is complete on all sides. Now, John is saying something quite significant here. For what John is really saying is this, that life at its best and life as it should be is a life that is complete on all sides. And so there are three dimensions of any complete life to which we can fitly give the words of this text: length, breadth, and height. Now, the length of life, as we shall use it here, is not its duration, not its longevity, but it is the push of a life forward to achieve its personal ends and ambitions. It is the inward concern for one's own welfare. The breadth of life is the outward concern for the welfare of others. And the height of life is the upward reach for God. These are the three dimensions of a complete life. And let us begin with the length of life. And I've said that this is a dimension in which the individual is concerned with developing his inner powers. In a sense, this is the selfish dimension of life. And that is such a thing as rational and healthy self-interest. If we are concerned about other selves, we must also be concerned about our own selves. This dimension of length also means that we have a legitimate responsibility to set out to discover what we are made for, to set out to discover our life's work, the center of our talent. And then after we discover this, we have the responsibility to do that life's work with all of the strength and all of the power and all of the commitment that we can muster up. We should do it so well that nobody could do it better. The individual must realize that no matter what this life's work happens to be, if it is for the upbuilding of humanity, It has cosmic significance. Everybody can't do the so-called big things. There must be those individuals who are willing to do a little job in a big way, to do the ordinary in the extraordinary way. And so to carry this point to one extreme, if it falls one's lot to be a street sweeper, he should seek to sweep streets like Raphael painted pictures, like Michelangelo carved marble, like Beethoven composed music, and like Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should seek to sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well. But we must not stop here. Some people never get beyond this first dimension of life. They're often brilliant people. They develop their inner powers to a great extent. But they live as if nobody else lives in the world. And that is nothing more tragic than to find an individual bogged down in the length of life and devoid of the breath. Now, the breath of life is, as I said earlier, the outward concern for the welfare of others. May I say to you this morning that an individual has not begun to live until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Now, I think this text has a great deal of bearing on the crisis which we confront in our nation in race relations. But in a real sense, the tensions which we witness in our nation can be explained by the fact that there are some individuals who are more concerned about length and breadth. There are some individuals who are more concerned about their so-called way of life, preserving a preferred economic position, preserving a particular political power structure. And if these persons would only add length to breadth, breadth to length rather, if they would only add the other regarding dimension to the self-regarding dimension, the jangling discords of our nation would be transformed into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Somewhere along the way, all men in this nation must come to see that all men are made to live together as brothers, because one comes to the point of knowing that discrimination on the basis of race or religion is wrong, and somebody must stand up. This is the dimension of breadth in the area of race relations. Now, this text also has a great deal of meaning in the international situation. It means that we must be concerned about other nations, for no nation can live alone in the world today. Nations are interdependent. All life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly, it affects all indirectly. John Donne placed it in graphic terms: no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And the recognition of this is a mastery of the dimension of breadth. And that is a final dimension. Many people never get beyond these first two dimensions, and so they seek to live life without a sky. But But if life is to be complete, I would suggest that the individual must rise up beyond his self-interest, even beyond humanity, and discover the eternal God whose purpose changes not. Now I know that some people have neglected this third dimension for honest intellectual reasons. They have looked out and noticed the problem of evil. They've looked out and noticed that's something that the poet Keats calls the giant agony of the world. And so they began to ask, if that is a good God, a loving God who is at the same time all-powerful, why does he allow evil of this nature to exist in the universe? Others have noticed the church, an organized religion. They've noticed that the church itself is often stagnant and lax. They've noticed the church itself is often a tail light instead of the headlight. They've noticed that people in the church all too often have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. And from this they have concluded that the church has no relevance for the social issues of our day. And so because of their disgust with organized religion, they have turned away from the third dimension of life. And then others find it difficult to square their intellectual worldviews with the sometimes unscientific and primitive dogmas of religion. But I suspect that most of the people who have neglected this third dimension have done it not for honest intellectual reasons, but because they have become so unconsciously involved in the things of life. And so they've ended up living on the plane of secularism and materialism unconsciously. But in spite of our theoretical denials, we continue to have spiritual experiences that cannot be explained in materialistic terms. In spite of our doubts, we continue to feel another order impinging upon us. In spite of our inordinate worship of things, ever and again something comes to remind us that the lasting and eternal things of reality are never seen. Well, you look here this morning, and I'm sure you're saying, I see Martin Luther King, and I guess I'm saying, I see you. But I say to you, you only see my body. You only see the external manifestation of me. You can never see my mind. You can never see my personality. You can never see the me that makes me me. Everything that we see is a shadow cast by that which we do not see. And so maybe Plato was right. The visible is a shadow cast by the invisible. And so even though we can't see God, it is still possible that God is in this universe. And so this dimension gives us a bit of faith in the future. It gives us a sense of cosmic companionship as we struggle to grapple with the problems of life and the problems of the universe. Before the victory for brotherhood is won, some may have to get scarred up, but we shall overcome. Before the victory for justice is won, some may be thrown in jail, but still we shall overcome. Before the victory for brotherhood is won, some will have to be misunderstood, but we shall overcome. Why? Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Love yourself, is by that you mean rational and healthy self-interest. You are commanded to do that. That is the length of life. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. You are commanded to do that. That is the breath of life. But never forget that that is the first and even greater commandment. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. that is the height of life. And when this is developed, the individual lives a complete life. Thank God for John, who centuries ago had vision of the New Jerusalem, and grant that those of us who live life today will decide to move toward that city of complete life in which the length and the breadth and the height are equal. And when we decide this collectively, figuratively speaking, the morning stars will sing together and the sons of God will shout for joy.
Director. Do you want to come and say something? Do you want to come and explain a little bit about perhaps some of the thought that went behind it? That would be amazing.
Good evening. If someone had said to me 26 years ago at the start of my journey that when we were trying to help young people between the age of 11 to 19 that would actually end up in a church, above a church, but more importantly, the church where Martin Luther King spoke when he came here, I wouldn't have believed him. But that's the beauty of not knowing what's outside there. That's the beauty of not knowing what we can all achieve. And if you go upstairs, the first thing you see as you walk into our space is whatever the mind of man can believe, he can achieve. And that's kind of really, really poignant. So my name is Hakeem, Mr. Impact. Actually got a biochemistry background, but there was something about empowering young people. Journey started in 1995, 26 years later. We have an Art for Social Change organization, and we're just really thrilled to be here in this space, working alongside Simon, Woodman, and being in this space. That's an array of our young people. There's 2 of them are age 14, 2 of them are age 17. We have an academy every Saturday, and the most important thing is that we're trying to reach what we call underprivileged, hard to reach young people. So it's all about social justice for me, because I didn't have any mentors growing up myself. So I kind of landed on my feet, but I have a commitment to do the same for young people. So thanks for watching, and I look out for you. Thank you very much.
Just a quick introduction. Emmanuel Gotora is lead organizer of TELCO in North London Citizens, and at Bloomsbury, does that sound a bit better? We work very closely with Citizens UK in terms of increasing participation, political participation across London, but getting involved when there's assemblies. It's very important to making an impact in the wider narrative of Camden, North London, and London as a whole. And we are very, very excited to welcome Emmanuel to talk more about the work that he does. So thank you so much.
Good evening. Good evening. Right, that's better. I know the dancers have left, but we still got the energy, you know? In their absence, I just want to say that was amazing to see. I have 2 girls who are actually starting their journey on in dance, one aged 11 and one aged 6. If they're half as good as these guys, I'll be happy with the money I spend for their dance. But just to follow that, really, it's an honor to be here to celebrate this occasion of 60 years since Martin Luther King preached here at Bloomsbury. And I want to thank Reverend Simon Woodman for the invitation. And particularly also want to pay tribute to all my colleagues at Citizens UK and the thousands of amazing leaders that we work with up and down the country and who have done so for the last 30 years. As was said before, my name is Emmanuel Gotora. I'm actually an assistant director at Citizens UK, as well as being the lead organizer in East London, our founding chapter, and North London. Collectively, about 140 organizations across 13 boroughs, ranging from outer east in Barking and Dagenham to northwest in Harrow and everything in between. Originally from Zimbabwe, we had a conversation before about Rhodesia and Rhodes and colonialism earlier this afternoon. And I'm actually proud to be part of the first generation of Zimbabweans to go to school after independence. What that really means for me is that everything changes, because I was born in 1973. If you're doing the maths, I'm 48. But in 1980, I actually started school as the first generation. Before that, the best schools were in white neighborhoods where Black people were not allowed to live. And the Rhodesian government spent 20 times as much money educating white children compared to Black children like me. But because of this education, and we can talk, if you know anything about Zimbabwe, you know the first thing that comes into your mind is Robert Mugabe. We can talk about Robert Mugabe another time, but actually, he's the reason I'm here in this country. I came to the UK on a scholarship because Robert Mugabe's background was he was a teacher. And so education was #1 priority at independence. I'm also very proud to be part of a community organizing tradition of social justice giants like Martin Luther King, who fought for equality and justice, including the desegregation of schools. So I've been asked to really bring out some of the contemporary outworkings of Dr. King's legacy in the UK context. And I want to lift up 3 examples from the work of Citizens UK. The first one is political education and mass participation. The second is embracing power as both desirable and necessary to achieve change. And I said 3 examples, there are 4. Having an evolving and realistic power analysis and the need for collective leadership. And that last one about collective leadership is really, really key and really, really important as we continue the conversation. For those of you who don't know, Citizens UK is part of an international movement which actually came out of the civil rights movement. In particular, there are 4 people who connect us to the civil rights movement: Edwin Chambers, or Ed Chambers, Arnie Graf, Mike Geekan, and Gerald Taylor. They were part of an organization in America called the Industrial Areas Foundation, and were among the hundreds and thousands of people active in the civil rights movement. They would later use the lessons they learned to build the IAF, Industrial Areas Foundation, who in turn trained and schooled hundreds of professional organizers, including myself and my colleague over here, Frankie is here from Citizens UK. Among them, they trained our founding director, Neil Jamieson, who pioneered community organizing in Britain, and he founded Citizens UK over 30 years ago. They also trained Father Leo Penta, who has translated community organizing very successfully into the German context. Amanda Tattersall, who founded the Sydney Alliance, Australia's first broad-based community organization. I'm pleased also because I've also, as part of this tradition, been given the amazing opportunity to deliver a community organizing learning exchange in South Africa and mentored leaders in this methodology in Namibia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Eswatini or Swaziland, Zambia, and Mozambique. So Citizens UK works with over 450 civil society organizations across the country, down south from Brighton and Hove to up north, Tyne and Wear, and everything in between. Our power comes from people working in institutions like Bloomsbury Baptist, working together on issues which matter to them. We build power to take action and to be at the table to negotiate change and participate in decisions which impact our lives and our communities. So the first thing is thinking about this. How do we embrace power as something that's desirable and necessary? Leaders and organizers in Citizens UK build an organization whose primary purpose is power. And that currency that Dr. Martin Luther King taught us about power, and his assertion is that the chief aim of power is social change. I like Dr. King's definition of power, and he says this: power, properly understood, is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic change. In this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that many people, including many Christians, who are not entirely comfortable with this idea of power as both desirable and necessary. I don't know if you want to respond or react to that in the tradition of Dr. King. If you're happy with power and you're comfortable with the idea, please raise your hand. Okay. Hopefully, if I ask you that question again at the end, we might have a few more people raising their hands. To be honest with you, if you had all raised your hands, then I don't think I would have a job. Particularly as an organizer, that is my function, my role, is to actually help people to figure out, find out, and actually recognize that they do have power. And that by joining with hundreds of other people, we can actually be more powerful. So, case in point, right? Partly, it's also because of the way that we have experienced power. I don't know how many of you didn't put your hands up because you've experienced power being used over you, or power being used negatively over you. There is that saying, I see a few nods in the back. There is that saying, I don't know if you know the saying, remember the saying, power corrupts. Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Actually, I deliberately misquoted that. It says power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It depends on you. If you have power, it depends on how you use your power. Again, interestingly, we can talk about Robert Mugabe and his use of power at another time, but I think it is true that we have experienced power largely used in a negative way and used over us. But actually, how many of you know that power is neutral? It can be used for good or for bad. I guess, again, it depends on you and it depends on me. In Citizens UK, we define power as the ability to act. We believe that the justice you win only depends on the power you have. The justice you win depends on the power you have. In other words, in order to make change, you need power. That is the argument. Also, Dr. King, in that same quote, reminds us that one of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. This is Dr. King's words. He also stressed that what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I'm going to ask you that question again. Not maybe if you're comfortable with power, but who wants this power? Raise your hand. Okay, a few more people. I might ask you the third time, see if everybody raises their hands, and then I won't really have a job. I've been doing this work for 20 years, actually, with Citizens UK, first as a leader through my church in North London, the New Testament Church of God in Wood Green, where I learned to embrace this type of power. I was introduced to what has become my vocation of community organizing by another brilliant preacher, Reverend Dr. Eric Brown, who was the founding chair of trustees for Citizens UK. Now, as I look back on my journey, I'm reminded of another quote from Dr. King, and it says this: "Those who love peace, the peacemakers, must learn to organize as well as those who love war." Now, over the 20 years that I've been doing this work, I found this statement to be a bit of a paradox. In order to organize for peace, I've had to do a bit of violence to myself. I'll explain what I mean. I've had to step out of my comfort zone in order to build power with other people to win change. I've had to choose faith and power over fear and powerlessness. Now, if power tends to corrupt, powerlessness also tends to corrupt. We just heard an extract of Dr. King's dimensions of a complete life. If we are powerless, we're unable to actually achieve those three dimensions, and we don't have a complete life. And that's what I mean when I say powerlessness also tends to corrupt. So my first leadership assignment, this is also very topical. You've heard a little bit about the living wage in the last week. You'll hear more next week as well in the coming couple of weeks. So my first leadership assignment as a leader within Citizens UK, now I was called a leader. My pastor came to me and said, "You are a leader." Like, me? I'm not a leader. I didn't see myself as a leader. I said, "Yeah, you're a leader. I'm going to give you 2 weeks," because I was actually working for the church. So they gave me time off. I'm going to give you 2 weeks. I want you to go and work with Citizens UK on this living age campaign. And the year was 2001. And so I did a little bit of that. They sent me to Liverpool Street to find cleaners who were working in the banks. And that's what I did. It was the scariest thing I'd ever done, because I had to hang out at bus stops, in the corridors of Liverpool Street. The world behind the tube station, if you've ever been to Liverpool Street, is a completely different world at night. I figured out that the cleaners who were working in the big banks had two shifts, one straight after 5 o'clock, and then one later on in the middle of the night as they changed shifts. And the living wage has actually come a long way. The first living wage bill was conceived, designed, and implemented in Baltimore in 1994. And the organizer who spearheaded that effort was an IAF organizer called Jonathan Lang. And in the UK, 20 years since it was created, the living wage is influencing government policy on low pay and is backed by 8,500 companies who pay the living wage on a voluntary basis. And you might have heard this week the government announcement that the mandatory minimum pay rate, also known as the national living wage, will go up to £9.50 an hour across the country, and that won't happen until April 2022. While this will benefit thousands of workers on low pay, the real living wage, which celebrates 20 years this year, is actually currently, as we speak, £9.50 an hour for those living outside London and £10.85 for those in London. And that's actually due to go up in a few weeks in November 2021. So the government national living wage has still got a way to catch up. In real terms, what this means is that the gap between the government's living wage, the national living wage, and the real living wage means that someone on a national living wage will need to work the equivalent of an extra month a year to earn the same as somebody on the real living wage. Now, if we're really going to build back better, we need more employers to go beyond this government minimum. According to the Living Wage Foundation, low pay and pay inequality is just one of those ways in which structural racism is evident in this country, and its effects are stark. Research conducted by the Living Wage Foundation and the New Economics Foundation showed that people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds are still more likely to be in low pay and insecure work than compared to their white counterparts. 18% of workers from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds are in low paid and insecure work, and also are having too few hours, 0 hours contracts, or short notice of shift patterns, compared to 15% of their white counterparts. According to the Living Wage Foundation, it shows that little has changed in the last 20 years. Now, my colleagues and I at Citizens UK have won hundreds of living wage campaigns over the years, but one which stands out for me is the story of St. Anthony's Primary School in Forest Gate. And they are marvelous campaigners. We saw young people from Impact Dance. We start them young in Citizens UK. These are primary school kids who convinced, firstly, Newham Council, and then London City Airport. And then this particular story is about Tate and Lyle, the sugar company. And so young people and teachers and staff at St. Anthony's Primary School built this campaign. And most of you will know that Tate and Lyle is a long-standing company in the UK. It has led the sugar industry since 1878, and it is the oldest company in London's Royal Docks. So St. Anthony's campaign included staff and students largely from African and Caribbean backgrounds whose histories have been shaped by sugar plantations and the transatlantic slave trade. Caroline Verdant, whose family is from Barbados, was one of the leaders on the campaign. She draws her inspiration from Harriet Tubman, who we all know freed thousands of slaves through the Underground Railroad. Caroline was the only Black person in the negotiation team to go to Tate and Lyle, speaking to the management to convince them to pay the living wage. And for her, she says that the accreditation means that they have agreed officially to pay the living wage, was just far more than just a positive step towards economic equality, but very much also a step towards racial equality, towards reversing a cycle that has lasted for centuries by ensuring that every worker is lifted up from in poverty work and given a sense of dignity. The third thing that I really want to lift up is how to think about power. And we say you need to have an evolving and realistic power analysis, a map, if you like, of how power operates around us. People don't act, as we have found in our work, not because they lack the motivation or the conviction, but because we often don't know where to start. Part of knowing where to start is understanding how much power you have and where your strength lies. Focusing on a specific issue and then figuring out the appropriate target. Having the right target is asking whether this particular person or authority has the power to be able to deliver on your demands, and whether, based on your particular strength, if you have the power to compel justice, to make the change that you want. And so for us in Citizens UK and London Citizens in particular, having a directly elected mayor of London has enabled our organization to make significant headway in turning London into a living wage city. 20 years ago, leaders from Citizens UK calculated that the organization had enough power to actually go on this journey. In 2001, our strongest base was in the East End, and that's why we actually targeted the banks in Canary Wharf and in Liverpool Street, because we figured actually that was a good calculation for us to win. And so the London Citizens campaign centered on Barclays and HSBC and 4 hospitals actually in East London, and in the course of time, all paid the living wage. And we employed a variety of tactics. One of my favorite ones from this story is a group of nuns would collect candle money from a Catholic church, and they wrote to HSBC. They didn't get a response, and they took that money, all the coins, lined up in the bank, changed the coins into notes, went to the back of the queue and changed the notes into coins. Literally held up the bank that day. They didn't do any business. And actually we were doing that because we wanted a reaction. We wanted a reaction from the bank to actually meet with us to talk about the living wage. And the rest, as they say, is history. So it took 2 years, actually. Eventually, both Barclays and HSBC paid the living wage. And in 2012, you might remember what happened in 2012. It seemed like a long time ago. The Olympics, we were proud to actually have the London 2012 Games as the first ethical Olympics, which meant that all the workers on the games, building the stadia and working during the games were paid a real living wage through the work of Citizens UK. We actually formed a temporary workers' union to ensure that they would get paid the living wage and were treated with dignity. So for us, we say there is no such thing as starting small. You start somewhere, and when you win, you ask, what's next? And this last point about the need for collective leadership really refers back to Dr. King and his legacy. And while Dr. King stands out as a charismatic and key figure of the civil rights movement, there are others like A. Philip Randolph, Rosa Parks, Bayard Rustin, and Ella Baker, who were part of that collective leadership, trained in the tools of community organizing. And we actually place a very high premium on that collective leadership because we find that that is actually the antidote to the Lone Ranger type of leadership, which is so easily co-opted if it doesn't burn out first. Too many times our leaders find themselves in corridors of power by themselves. And Dr. King understood the value of collective leadership. Most of you will remember the March on Washington. What was the other title? The rest of the title of the March on Washington was for what? For jobs and freedom. Most of you will also know, the historians among us at the back, that this march was actually a culmination of two marches. Philip A. Randolph had planned the March for Jobs. Actually, he'd been convinced some years before to call off a march and was promised some stuff that never really happened. And so this time around, he joined up with Dr. King, who had planned the March for Freedom. So it was called the March for Jobs and Freedom because it was that culmination of those two marches, which brought 250,000 people to the Lincoln Memorial in August 1963. So collective leadership is really, really key, really important in our work. And while it takes time to build, the beauty of this type of leadership, it's not the only type of leadership, but it's the type of leadership that we found to be effective, is that it brings people from different backgrounds together. In the living wage example, cleaners, security guards, students, clergy, nuns, and children all bring their unique talent and creativity. And I can guarantee you, we have lots of fun doing some of this stuff, tackling some of these serious issues. And I'm proud actually of the work that some of my colleagues are doing to embed this form of active citizenship and leadership in our primary and secondary schools. So in conclusion, it's not a long conclusion, it's a short one. We are faced in this generation with our own struggles. We can look back at Dr. King and his contemporaries, but what about us? Every generation has its key formative moments, key struggles that define it. And for me, actually, the entry into this type of work, which was mentioned before this afternoon, was the murder of Stephen Lawrence. I think the whole globe is being, the whole world has been impacted by another murder of George Floyd. And so that is one of the key issues of our day. There are other issues, refugee resettlement, structural and institutional racism, affordable housing, community safety, health inequality, climate justice. We're talking about climate change at COP26. And these all really call for collective leadership. No one organization, no one approach can actually win this. And here I want to end with a tribute to our colleagues at Black Lives Matter and the way that they have done mass participation, which has powerfully unmasked the historic impact of slavery and racism on Black and brown populations across the world. However, the challenge for all of us now is how we build on that momentum to achieve real structural change in the material lives of Black and brown people. 2 months before the march on Washington, President Kennedy met with Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph to voice his concern that the march, and in his words, was perhaps ill-timed, and that the issues would be better won in Congress, not with a big show at the Capitol. To which Dr. King replied, telling the president, "Frankly, I have never engaged in any direct action which did not seem ill-timed." So the challenge is for us, those of us who love peace must learn to organize more effectively than those who love war. The urgency of now for our generation demands that we take a similar stance on specific issues, landing responsibility at the feet of decision makers, but also playing our role at the negotiation table. We need to act, or we will always be acted upon. We owe it to future generations in the same way that Dr. King left us his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. That was excellent. So now we have Ife Thompson joining us from online. Liz, is it possible to get Ife spotlit? We haven't rehearsed this online, so this is going to be super interesting. Oh my gosh, hello. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you. Can you?
I can't hear you though.
You can't hear me.
Oh, I can hear you now. That's fine. This is so interesting. Yay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'll introduce Ife before we get into it. So as said before, Ife Thompson is a barrister, community-based activist, writer, human rights defender, and the founder of 2 civil society organizations that have done excellent work, especially over the past year and a bit, 18 months. BLAM UK and Black Protest Legal Support UK. And during this space, we want to give you a space to talk more about that work, as well as talk more about what brings you to it and how you were inspired to found these organizations. So I guess I'd start with a question I've partially answered, but I want you to answer it in your own words. Who are you? And why do you do the work that you do?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Ife. I think it's always important to like ground yourself in like your past, so also your present as well. So I feel like for me, I'm a working class girl that grew up in Brixton, of Nigerian descent. So my like culturally, my home are like a Yoruba home. I grew up in Brixton, which is has a lot of Caribbean influences, particularly Jamaican influences. So I would say those experiences of like being a Nigerian person, living in the UK, growing up in Brixton, which is such an important place for the Black community, being around all of that excellence and thinking about like what it means to create spaces for Black people and being in the Black space. I think those are all the things that led me to be who I am today. So like my Nigerian heritage, but also the fact that I live in Brixton, I'm in the community, grew up in a council estate. So I think all those things add and make me who I am, and they all intersect. So yeah.
I think intersectionality is a really key aspect that was explored a bit earlier today, but I really want to highlight the intersection of Blackness and working classness, especially as it's been highlighted in the past couple of months, years, as something that kind of places you at greater risk for violence. Is there any experiences or any encounters that really kind of set your trajectory? And even if there's not, I would think that there's a tendency to kind of ignore the class and race intersection that affects a lot of people's lives. So I'd love you to like speak more about that as it relates to your work.
Yeah, so for me, what comes to mind when I think about Blackness and the fact that we're disproportionately working class, it links back to the idea of racial capitalism. So you have a system in society that is based around allocating wealth based on your race. And we know that historically under white supremacy and because of just the transatlantic slave trade, we know that people that are Black haven't been afforded any access to wealth because they are Black, or access to freedom because they are Black. So in terms of wealth and the division of wealth and access to wealth, it was something that was and has been and remains to be allocated on the basis of the racial hierarchy. So even, you know, now we've got the, you know, race pay gap. It's this idea of who is deemed accessible to certain amounts of wealth and who is deemed to be able to have access to that wealth. So I think it's important to think about the idea of racial capitalism, the racialized nature of it. But as you also mentioned, we grew up in, well, particularly Black people within the global north, we disproportionately live in poverty, therefore we are disproportionately working class. And by living in poverty, we live in areas that have high levels of unemployment, high levels of violence, high levels of, you know, just a lot of pain. You know, that's something that we see around us, but then we resist by making spaces where we can seek Black joy. That's something that's was really important to me. But I would say, particularly living in Brixton and just seeing how the state inflicts so much violence on my community in terms of like how our community is over policed, again, underprotected, and even from a young age, always kind of knowing that our Blackness was seen as a threat. So I think, you know, growing up in Brixton and seeing how often like my, you know, family members, my cousins, my brothers were like policed and how they moved for society, but also just seeing how we didn't have access to like anything, like education systems were not as, you know, as for me, I feel like the whole education system in and of itself is not catered to serve Black people, but in terms of our narratives being excluded from the curriculum, but also like the lack of investment in schools within our communities and things like that. So I think just the violence from the state by, you know, not giving us access to wealth, or, you know, even the estates that we live on. So I live opposite, like I grew up opposite the Miteswood estate. So in the Miteswood estate, you know, that is an estate that it's been knocked down now. But that estate was really neglected by the council, you know, overcramped living conditions. Many people that lived there, you know, had high levels of unemployment. So when you're living in a space like that where the area is neglected, and you see the violence the state inflicts on communities by not giving them access to, you know, safe housing or housing that is adequate, and the young people that have access to like community spaces or like no youth centers and things like that, you see, you know, the injustice, the racialized injustice in your community. And I think that drives you to want to organize and think about doing for self, because we know the state is not going to do this for us. So it's thinking about how we can imagine or create a space where Black people are thriving, right? And we're able to, you know, be free. So I think that living in a community like Brixton and seeing, you know, the repression of the Black community and the ongoing violence from the state, both institutionalized and systemic, really pushed me to think about how I can be a community organizer. And one of the first people I knew about that were community organizing was the Black Campaign Party, and learning about them really gave me a sense of direction and a hope in terms of seeing people that have done this. I've thought about organizing on a community-based level and ensuring that, you know, we fight for what we need. So I think those are the catalysts and driving factors in terms of my organizing as a community organizer.
Thank you so much. And I was going to kind of ask you about those catalysts, but the Black Panther Party, obviously contemporary of Martin Luther King, but also that sense of the state will not do it for us and does not care about us, so we must care about ourselves. And it's so evident in your work. I kind of wanted to start off with Black Protest Legal Support, set up in the pretty much immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and was a hugely important organization during the Black Lives Matter protests, but also throughout protests in the months since. And I'd love to talk about Martin Luther King was a movement leader, was a movement figure, and Richard Reddy highlighted seeing his boots and the shirt that he'd wear as he was going on these protests. You're a barrister, and movement lawyering and that kind of action is a huge part of well, it is the essence of Black protest legal support. So I'd love you to talk more about that and how it sits within this legacy of social justice.
Yeah, so I think, I remember when I learned about Martin Luther King in school, I was in year 2, and we learned about him and we learned about Rosa Parks, but, interestingly, we never learned about the fact he came to London and how he even helped and inspired the Bristol boycotts and things of that nature. And I think, not being able to even relate to narratives, I think for me, even being able to see Black people and learn about them was something that I was like, oh my gosh, wow, there's like a time in Black History Month we can learn about Black people, which is obviously amazing. But it would have been so nice to be able to at least have that connection to the transnational organizing and the fact that he came to the UK. But we move. We're trying to obviously be sure that those coming up can have access to those narratives that we never had access to as well, right? So it's kind of thinking about, okay, what was missing and how can we create a space where that doesn't happen again. So that's definitely something that drives my work. And when thinking about Black protest legal support and movement lawyering, for me, I always say that I'm a community organizer before I'm anything. And for me, that's particularly important because that grounds me in the community. So the reason why BPS was started is because when I went to the BLM protests and uprisings in 2016, there was one in Brixton, and there's one I even organized in Brixton myself. There was no legal observers. And I remember another person who was on the BLAM committee was telling me that when she went to the larger protests that were in West End, like there was no legal observers. The police were literally manhandling the Black protesters, stopping and searching them at random. Just the normalized over-policing our communities, but on a more intimate scale because they were so close to all the protesters, right? And we're a community that's mourning. We are experiencing trauma and in a space where we're grieving and we're showing up for those that have been killed by state violence, we are inflicted with more violence. So hearing those stories, hearing that Black protesters were going to these uprisings and not being able to have access to legal observers or anyone that can at least hold the state to account within the state's frameworks, right? Because we always say,
I think I'd also say that like there's an interruption there of like that it's a very necessary intervention between in that time where you are imprisoned for whatever charge they might have given to you, anything can happen to you, and in the absence of legal representation it can be quite dire. I'll also just ask, because there's a range of these in the building, is it possible to slow down slightly? Because I think that, yeah, I'm also a very fast talker, but you were just, not to interrupt you, sorry, but you were talking about the necessity of the legal observers. And BPLS also trains legal observers as well.
Yes, we do both. So in terms of the 2016 uprisings, that for me, put on my mind, because I was an organizer, but also I was there at the protests, that, if there's any other uprising of that nature, we need to ensure that there are legal observers there. So in terms of when the uprisings came in 2020, the first thing that came to my mind was how can we ensure that there will be legal observers at these uprisings? And also another thing that came to my mind is I was seeing what was going on in America and seeing how they were organizing, particularly using Twitter, and seeing how they had lawyers who were acting pro bono and were like, how can we support with bail fund, and thinking about ways they could show up for protesters. And I was saying the UK legal scene needs to do something for our people that are uprising as well, right? And I was waiting on Twitter to see if anything was going to happen. I was thinking like, am I seeing any tweets? I didn't see anything, and I was really moved. And I said, you know what? I'm going to put a tweet out. I'm going to call for lawyers to act pro bono and also take part in legal observing. And we had an amazing response from Twitter, like loads of people retweet, I think over 3,000 retweets. And like the first lawyers that signed up were Garden Court lawyers. And, Garden Court is a set that is really known for giving back to the community, but also standing up for injustice and thinking about human rights and not being afraid. Like their motto is do right, fear no one. So they're, in terms of in chambers and thinking about the legal scene, they are a set that practice movement lawyering and the idea of like lawyers showing up for the community and ensuring that the community's human rights and things of that nature are being protected. So when we had all the lawyers join and support, that for me was really amazing. So the first week of the protests, we had over 100 lawyers on the ground, you know, doing legal observing. And for me, that was really important because the whole idea of movement lawyering is lawyers being part of the movement. So there's not this idea that, you know, you only come in at the court stage. It's
Yeah.
actually, how can I use my legal skills within the community? How can I use that at the protest? So it's about thinking about how we can use our legal skills to serve the community. And for me, movement lawyering is really important because the idea of that we have of lawyers is that they're the ones that know all the answers, that they are the ones that, you know, will be in court, you know, making all the arguments. But the idea of like movement lawyering is actually lawyers listening to the movement and saying, what do you need? How can we be of service? Whether that be acting pro bono, whether that be legal observing, whether that be, you know, raising awareness of what's going on the ground so we can ensure that the state's held to account. Is thinking about how lawyers can be of service to their clients, which kind of changes the traditional relationship between lawyer and client, and kind of puts the lawyer down to the level of the client, which is really important as well. So for me, it was out of necessity because I knew how in 2016 our community was already over policed, but also the fact that I'm seeing organisers in the US thinking about these things of legal observers on the ground. And for me, as I mentioned earlier, I'm someone who loved the Black Panthers and really a big fan of Black intercession and Pan-Africanism as well. So it was really important to think about how we can mirror what they're doing, but also ensure that those on the ground uprising in the UK are having their legal rights protected as well.
Thank you so much. That's really comprehensive, and it's also really good for mapping the stakes of this. It's incredibly high stakes. It's people's lives. And I think it's also very inspiring when you're looking at Twitter, and it can so often be a kind of impetus for doom scrolling, or just like the world is awful, the world is awful. And for you to see this absence and meet it in such a phenomenal way, like BLAM raised an immense amount of money to do that work and to carry out. So that's wonderful. I think taking us back to Dr. King's sermon and the snippets that we heard slightly earlier, you wear a lot of hats, and I respect that. And that's an incredible amount of work that you're doing, not just for the community, but also in a kind of smaller sense, a sense of fulfillment. But what I think is very important, we're in a room of so many people who organize to some extent in their community, is that first dimension that Dr. King talked about, that sense of like self-care. And obviously it's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to all of us, especially as Black women, sometimes like it's your own needs that are on the back burner. But in the midst of all this organizing and this incredibly important work, I really want to know more about not just the interior drivers, but like how do you take care of that heart, that innermost part of yourself? Because I mean, I'm too Black to be naive about this, but it's hard out here. Like it's hard to confront the face of state violence and to kind of constantly be throwing yourself up against that wall. So I really want to know about where that space for self-care occurs within you.
Yeah, so like what comes to mind is that quote by Audre Lorde, and she was like, you know, self-care is an act of, you know, preservation against a system that is out to ensure that, you know, we are defeated. So I think when we think about resistance, it has to be interpersonal, and also it has to be the community as well. So I think being able to give back to the community, you have to have that time to rest. And I love the fact that Martin Luther King spoke about that as well, because it's so easy to burn out, you know, when you're doing this and you're feeling like there's so much there and how can I give back and what can I do? You don't make time for yourself. So I think in order for you to be of use to the movement, you have to have that time to rest. And there's a really, really amazing woman on Twitter that I follow that runs the NAP ministry. And her work looks particularly at like thoughts from Afrofuturism, Black liberation theory, a mixture of like different like radical Black ideologies. And she talks about like the revolution will be well rested, and she really links the history of Black people not being able to rest because we have to work 2 jobs, or, you know, in enslavement Black people didn't have, you know, any time to rest at all. So the idea of like even rest is a form of reparations because we're overworking, we're always on overdrive. So for me, I just be like, you know, if I need to take a nap during the day, I take a nap, and that for me is a way of keeping myself well, because I need that time to recuperate. I need that time to just rest, clear my mind. And it's okay to rest. And I think just even little things like that, it seems so small, but in the grand schemes of things, when thinking about Black communities, and the fact that we haven't had that time to rest, we don't get afforded those holidays, things like that, is really important. So I think with the work that I do, I'm really intentional about like the self-care. And then like luckily for us as well, because I work for BLAM, and BLAM, our funders know that we do work on mental health and well-being, right? And they even gave all of our staff members a well-being grant, so we can like every month spend money on anything to make us feel well. So I think it's what I realized, that society as a whole is thinking about well-being and like wellness, but also thinking about those that are giving back to communities and, you know, fighting against injustice. We need time to, you know, love ourselves and also to be able to give back. So it's all part of the process. In order for us to give back, we have to be charged up, right? So I think taking that time out, having that time to like, you know, charge myself up, be grounded, that definitely drives me.
Thank you. As what a great leader said, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love it to somebody else? But yeah, that's really, it's something that I think it needs to be highlighted, because there's a sense of the inexhaustibility of Black activists. It's like when something goes wrong or Donald Trump does said something crazy, it's like Black women will save us. And I think in a world that this gives out so much violence towards Black bodies, giving those same bodies space to rest is articulating their value. So that's wonderful. I want to talk a bit more about BLAM, and there's been a huge amount of education going on throughout this day, and the work that you do there is also very important. But before we kind of round off with that, I also wanted to ask, you're a Christian, and obviously we bring all of ourselves to the work we do, or we should if we're doing that work well. How does that Christian faith impact and drive your work? And do you feel any kinship with Martin Luther King there?
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, when I was younger, I first learned about Martin Luther King through Black History Month when I was like, you know, maybe like 7, 8. And for me, it was just amazing to think about, you know, one, we saw Black people, you know, in the school, and it was like, wow, like we can learn about Black people, but also the fact that they were fighting for Black rights. And I think for me, from a young age, I've definitely resonated with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks because of the fact that it was just amazing for me in the curriculum to see Black organisers and just seeing Black people in the curriculum, because you never saw that. So I think from when I was a young person, I was infatuated with the fact that this organisation had happened. So I think from then, that's when I knew about Martin Luther King. But I would say as I got older, it became, for me, problematic how the Eurocentric education system pits Martin Luther King against Malcolm X, because they're both two amazing Black leaders that I love, and I draw on from both of them in terms of my activism and my the work that I do. But I think the conflict I have with the way the white mainstream society has portrayed King is something that for me, it's almost as if we have to choose a side. And I think, you know, that can't be the case. It can't be white society telling us how we should, you know, be able to feel and to plot our liberation. You know, you can't be a liberator and an oppressor. It can't work. So I think for me, the education system kind of put in a space. I remember, I think in year 10, we did a project on like what Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. And I think those kind of things are really unhelpful in terms of how we as Black people understand what our liberation could look like and how we can draw on different thinkers in terms of plotting our liberations. I think my conflict with the way Martin Luther King has been portrayed in white society and used to weaponize like activists who are saying that we need to, you know, we need to start fresh, like we need a revolution. It's like, oh, but what would Martin Luther King do? And it's used in a way to weaponize and further white supremacy. I think that's definitely something that's been of conflict to me. But, you know, reading Martin Luther King's work, you know, the fact that he was, you know, big on poverty, big on like even like internationalism and thinking about injustice globally is something that's particularly important to me. So I resonate really, really closely with Martin Luther King's work, and it, for me, showcases what it is as a Christian to give back and to ensure that racial justice is centered in your work. And I think too often now people try to come with this like colorblind theology in church and not want to talk about race. And I can always be like, oh, but hold on, Martin Luther King spoke about race in church and he's an amazing preacher. So I think for me, it's really important that we have someone that can be like, hold on, you can't say that we can't bring race into the equation, or, you know, this idea that God doesn't see race, because he made us all different races because that's what he thought was great and we were all made in his image. And I think it's important to remember that if God didn't want that, he wouldn't have done that. So I think it's really important to kind of take away from this colorblind ideology and actually think about how important Christians have been in like the movement for racial justice and how Martin Luther King was important. And again, for me, I would say being a Christian does definitely drive my work, because I know how important it was for Jesus to be with those that were oppressed, those in society that weren't liberated. And again, even thinking about like a lot of Black people that were organizing rebellions and uprisings during this enslavement period and transatlantic slave trade, a lot of them drew on like the fact that, you know, they need to be set free, and like they drew on Moses, and that's what helped them to keep going. So I think it's particularly important to think about how you know, in that context, it has been used as a way to support like liberation and also hope. But I think it's also important when we're in that space as well to not be blind to the role that the church played in like enslavement and slavery, and, you know, what that meant to the Black communities. I think it's a critique of both, but also understanding how for a lot of Black people, how, you know, hope and also like just being able to have that time alone to pray and to think about like the fact that God will fight on your behalf and he's with you because you are oppressed, and just thinking about if Jesus was here now, he'd be with the Black communities uprising with us. Do you know what I mean? So I think those kind of things are particularly important and give us the push that we need. And I think for me anyways, that gives me the push that when I need time alone, I'm taking time to pray, and that's part of my, you know, self-care, like being connected to God and being able to use that and knowing that, you know, he is with those that are oppressed, and that gives me so much joy. But also you know, we're fighting the evil in the world, and, you know, that's God despises evil. So I think for me it's really important to have that as an organizer, have that connection to God and have that hope, and just know that, you know, he was with those that were oppressed, and this work is particularly important because, you know, God doesn't want us to be oppressed. Do you know what I mean?
No, you're quite right. And I think that it's really helpful that you highlighted that at the time that Martin Luther King was alive, there would have been a lot of Christians saying that what you are doing is not Christian, even in the aftermath of like reading Exodus and seeing people who were enslaved being set free. There's so many points of freedom and liberation within the Bible, and the whole trajectory, as Martin Luther King said, is towards freedom and justice. So it's so interesting to hear how that informs your work. I'd love to take some questions from people who are online or in the building with us here in Bloomsbury. I'd also like to invite Emmanuel Gotora back up to kind of begin the Q&A section of this evening. But thank you so much for sharing so much about your work. And also, yeah, I'd love to rearrange some furniture, first of all. But give space for other people to kind of seek clarity or anything that they want to seek clarity on. And yeah, ask them some more general questions. Give me one moment and I'll just reorganize myself. So, oh, yeah. Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Is that audible? One. Okay, that's fine. Is that better? Oh, that is better. Excellent. Okay, great. Does anyone have any questions, burning questions right now? Okay, so we use the word Black or Asian, not I'm not sure. There tends to be more conservatives elected right now because that's who got into power. But I'll open that up to Ife and Emmanuel.
So I didn't hear the question.
Oh, so the question was, why are there more people of color in the Conservative government than in the front bench of the Labour Party? Honestly, Frank, I do not know on the basis. Yeah, I'm chairing, but I'm also not sure how what any of us.
I think that speaks particularly to representation politics, and the idea of the dominant ideology being able to co-opt those that are Black and brown, even if it's not in the interest of the group in its entirety, like the group. Capitalism promotes this idea of individuality and this individualism. So what you might have is Black and brown people in spaces that are making decisions that are harmful towards Black and brown people. Priti Patel said that with my current immigration policies, my parents couldn't enter the country. So they are doing things that are actively harmful to them as a Black and brown person, but because they've made it in a space and whiteness allowed them in a space, they're able to be like, okay, well, I'm here, doesn't matter about you. So I think it's just more about this idea of individualism and that being promoted in that sense, and this idea of, you know, Zora Neale Hurston said that not all skin folk are kinfolk. So just because somebody is a racialized person doesn't mean they are with the collective. Some people are out to just do for themselves only, and if that means the detriment of their own community, they don't care as long as they have a seat at the table. So I think it's to do with that, I'd say, and this idea of like faces in certain spaces make people feel as though, oh, maybe there's progression going on, but no, it's just one person being able to get into that space, and, you know, not doing anything that's actively beneficial for their communities on a large scale.
That's a better answer than I'd be able to give.
Honestly, I have no idea in terms of what the direct question is, but I think for Citizens UK, actually, we are non-partisan. So we work with whoever's in power, whether it's Conservatives or Labour or anybody else. And I think for us, kind of draws really on that kind of prophetic tradition of Dr. King, in that regardless of who's in power, we'll speak truth to power in that same way. So for us, it doesn't matter really that you know, there's more Black and Asian people in the Tory cabinet or government than there are front benches in the Labour Party. We work with whoever's in power.
Thank you. Excellent. I think also there's a sense, even within the work of Dr. King, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there were absolutely people in the time of the civil rights movement that were his contemporaries, but that were nevertheless collaborating with the people who were enforcing Jim Crow policies and supported segregation in schools and were still Black. And it's very important to say that, like, there are particular ideas that are underpinning the work of Dr. King, not just about seeing Black faces in the right places in terms of in power, but what are they doing there? Which is why that continued activism is still very necessary. I think another thing that might be positive to ask is that how can people help? Because we're kind of moving towards the action-oriented side. Like, how can people participate in the work that is done by Citizens UK, BPLS, BLAM? Like, where can people intervene? What is needed to continue this work?
I think for me, it was telling the reaction or response to power. I think we have a bit of work to do together in terms of building this power across the racial, religious divides. I think for us in Citizens UK, the kind of broad-based methodology means that we work together across the kind of what society tells us that we shouldn't actually be working together. So I think the first thing is to really think about how we work together to build that power, not just for Black and brown people, but for every single person in our community on issues that we care about, on issues that impact all of us. I mean, there will be some issues that predominantly affect Black and Asian people in this country. We've heard about stop and search, we heard about overrepresentation in prisons. One of the particular areas that we're working in Citizens UK, my colleague Froy is here as well, we're working on exclusions. In other boroughs, there is disproportionate school exclusions, particularly of Black Caribbean boys. And so we're working with Deputy Mayor of London to actually try and address some of those issues. We're working with local authorities. Next year is the local authority election. So we're trying to use that political opportunity to actually try and address some of those issues. But we've got to build power. And by power, we mean people power. People coming together, being in relationship beyond, the one showing up once. You need to show up time and time again because you care about this issue. And so I think that's, we have a lot of work to do just on the temperature of this room.
Thank you. Ife, what can we do to help you?
Well, I think like one of the most obvious ones to sustain the work that we do and to give back to the community, we ensure that everybody's paid. It's really important because so all too often with Black organizing and activism, we don't get paid to this work. This work isn't paid. And we already mentioned the idea of or the notion of racial capitalism and the fact that Black people are all too often expected to work for free or not paid adequately for the work that we do. So, at BLAM and BPLS, we pay everyone that works on our projects because for us, it's important that those that are sustaining and helping liberate the community are also sustained in their own homes and sustained in living through this society. So funding, if you can give us some donations, like that keeps the work going for us. So in terms of how people can be of help, if you want the projects to be sustainable and to have longevity, we need funding. I mean, one of our big things is that we are funded a lot by the community. So loads of people give money from the community. And for me, it really invokes the idea of like this kind of like mutual aid notion where the community is given to sustain the community. So it's like the little that we have, we'll put it together to make a better society. So I think for me, not relying on state funding or not having any funding from the state, but actually thinking about how we can get funding from other means so we are completely independent of the state and we can critique the state and hold the state to account is really important at BLAM. So yes, definitely giving us funding to sustain our work and donations is really important. Also spreading awareness about what we do as well. Like we are based in different schools in Lambeth doing teacher trainings and running workshops with Black children to really improve their racial esteem. And what I really liked about what Martin Luther King said is that there are Black people that go through the world and they've internalized anti-Black stereotypes and anti-Black racism, so they have negative views about their Blackness. So the work that we do at BLAM is thinking about how we can undo that learning, how we can actually have Black people that believe that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, like God said that they are. Do you know what I mean? So being able to let more people know about our work means that we can go into more schools and do the projects in schools and support more Black children to not internalize negative narratives and have their racial esteem uplifted. Also, in terms of like, we also do some work on school exclusions because we know that Black children are disproportionately excluded from schools. So in terms of like letting more Black parents know that we offer this free service is a way to support the community. So it can be through awareness raising, same with BPLS, so people know that any Black organisers that are organising any sort of racial justice protests, we can send legal observers to support them and help them as well. So it's just one thing that I'm really big on is more people knowing that we exist. So more people can access our services. We also have a project called Zootherapy, which is a free racial wellness workshops we hold for the Black community in the UK. So any Black person in the UK can sign up to it. And for us, it was really important to have the racial wellness workshops because majority of the times when Black people go to access therapy in the NHS, they'll meet a white therapist who doesn't understand like racial trauma or how racism affects their well-being, and will be enacting racism in a safe space. So we create a space in which they can access Black therapists for free in a group setting, and start the journey to racial wellness and thinking about like how racism can affect their well-being, but how we can find a way to resist, but also to maneuver and think about like Black joy and think about like what racial wellness is as a Black person. And we do that over 4 weeks every month. So letting people know about that service is really important as well. So for me, it's definitely funds to sustain our work and awareness of the projects that we do so more Black people can benefit from the services that we provide.
Thank you. So just to recap, it's funds, money makes the world go around, and it absolutely is of benefit to community organizations to allow people to survive and rest whilst they're doing that work. But I guess it's also raising awareness, like BLAM have worked extensively on school exclusions and on supporting school children, Black school children are not facing that kind of racial oppression and violence in their schools from head teachers, and providing access to free therapists for Black people, so people are able to access like joy and the identification of like speaking to a Black therapist and knowing that they understand the experience of racism. It's so liberatory and so widely beneficial, so thank you. Are there any other questions from people in person or watching on Zoom? Yes.
This is for obviously Emmanuel and Ife. In terms of the work that you do in terms of campaigning and organizing, would you encourage any of your supporters to run for elected office? And if so, what are the inherent dangers of that?
Good question, actually. Yes. However, and we have had actually people, leaders in our organization doing that, but because we are strictly non-partisan, they've actually had to step down from the leadership positions in order to do that. Because we've seen the kind of relation, because our approach is relational. We want to build relationships with people in power and approach it that way. And so if any of our leaders are going to run for office, they actually need to stand down. And you know, if they succeed, we need good people in place of power. We're happy for them. And maybe they're sitting on the other side of the table. But again, we always lean into those kind of relationships in a way that's productive and positive. So yeah, I think, you know, we're all up for good people using power in a good way.
I think there's this notion on this idea that the only way we can have power is only within the state. And I think that's really harmful because communities have power themselves to organize. And the idea of Black power was thinking about looking in the community and how we can survive and sustain ourselves without relying on the state, which remains a harmful force to our communities. So, I mean, for BLAM, it doesn't really fall in the remit of our work because we work in the community, thinking about how we can organize and make changes to our community without relying on the state. How can we show up for ourselves? So for me, you know, we don't do anything around that because that's just not in line with our work. And a person who I'd really like to draw upon is the late Douglas Howe, who wrote an amazing piece around like people that go into like political power office, like they think like going and doing like leafleting and you know, just, you know, saying a speech and then going home, that is organizing in the community, or that's some sort of political activism. And like the way that we view it is from a radical Black tradition lens, which is like organizing in the community. Like that is for us liberatory, that is for us power, that's us not relying on the state, not relying on those elected, you know, not relying on that for us is power, because we're thinking about how we can show up for ourselves. And yeah, he talks a lot around like community organizing being the basis of what we're doing, and we know how important it is that we show up for each other. We live in collectivity, so we don't need to wait for any officials to get into power before we can do anything. Like we have power within ourselves to change our realities by coming together as a people in a collective. So we're all about community organizing within the community. So that question that you asked doesn't really fall in the remit of our work at all.
Thank you for two very different answers, but I think also quite useful just to see that when you talk about Black organizing, you're not talking about a particular single monolithic thing. There's so many different approaches that could be taken. Some that see like governmental power and like as a really important way of exercising power and influence for the benefit of your community. And so let's say actually a more grounded approach and more mutual aid within the community as their chosen method of enacting change. So that's really wonderful. We've got time for just one more question. Yes.
I took somewhat exception to some of the answers to the last one, in that the people who have the keys to power, who have the purse strings in their hand, are the politicians. In the end, we have to convince them that they are the ultimate objective. Their behavior, their way they vote must be the end product of our pressure. So to that degree, we're a pressure group. We're talking about pressure groups here. And I'd just like to finally say, if any of you have a quick idea how you stop your groups becoming too pure, too fundamental, only adopting a very narrow approach to a solution.
So the question is, how do you stop too narrow an approach to I guess changing the society and changing the world? Does that be correct? Okay, cool. So in general, how do you avoid becoming zealots?
I think for us, so Citizens UK uses a particular methodology of what we call universals that can be applied in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and as I've experienced across Southern Africa as well. The tactics differ. So you might approach an issue using the same methodology, but the tactics differ. You take the example of Dr. King. What worked in Montgomery didn't work in Albany. What worked for the bus boycott there was targeting, if you like, a particular area around kind of, because by then the civil rights movement had a blueprint. You create a situation, i.e. refuse to give up your seat, you get a disproportionate reaction, and then you force the federal government to act. That worked in Montgomery, that tactic worked. Albany was very different. Albany, they tried the same blueprint, didn't work, particularly because they picked the wrong target. And the target they picked, I believe the chief of police was, I can't remember his name now, but he was not as, Pritchard. He was not as extreme as a police chief in Montgomery. So the deals that they had made, in order to gain national attention, King and different leaders would, they'll be arrested, sent to prison, then they get the federal government to act. That didn't happen in Albany. In Albany, the less extreme Pritchard did not do that, let them out. And so the deals that they had made didn't stand. So for us, it's really a matter of applying the universals in the methodology, but using different tactics. I guess in Albany, if they had targeted maybe the businesses, they might have had more success than kind of try and get a political reaction. So methodology, yes, tactics different.
We're just about out of time, but if you have anything to say on that subject of avoiding fundamentalism or of zealotry.
For me, I don't know, that question or comment felt quite violent, because my position was that we don't have to rely on the state or politicians. And I felt like that question or comment was directed to me because I was stating that we don't want to engage with relying on someone to get into power to change things. I mean, we've had Barack Obama in the White House that didn't bring about liberation for Black people. So this idea of relying on state-based mechanisms will not liberate Black communities. The master's tools will not destroy its house. I think for me, we follow the tradition of Black radical organising that's worked in our communities, that has sustained us, that has brought us liberation and joy. And it's a blueprint, and it has worked. So I think for me, I'm going to keep doing what I've seen our elders do, and seen its success in that. So we don't rely on these systems because they cannot liberate us, and the power has always been and will remain with the people. When you think about things like the French Revolution, it's the people that brought about that revolution, right? So I think this narrow idea of that, direct democracy is the only way to create change. Is this way of the establishment controlling how we perceive change is possible. Like, I divest from that completely, and we think about things like Afrofuturism, creating a future on our own terms, how we deem fit, in whatever way we think is necessary, and as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. So for me, we do what is necessary and what is possible to imagine a Black future of liberation.
Thank you so much. We have to end there, but Ife, that was excellent, and thank you, Emmanuel, as well. I just want to. So Simon, would you like to close off?
Friends, it's been a fantastic day and a wonderful evening. We have had a feast for our eyes with the dance, for our ears with what has been said, and I hope for our souls. I am absolutely convinced that community organising is the most effective way I have come across of organisations such as churches and other organisations that exist at civic society making a change in society. I am committed to it. I invite you to learn from what Emmanuel and Ife were saying about the power of people to effect change for justice in society, because this is the legacy of Dr. King, and it is the legacy for this city and for this time. So have a wonderful evening. Go into the world and make the world better together. Good night, everybody.